me start off, Tony, by asking you what inspired you to write this book about Noam Chomsky.
Well, I should clarify. I saw this book, I see Chomsky really as a vehicle to explore issues that were of interest to me.
Yes.
And I just discovered, I hadn't read Chomsky since the Vietnam War. I started writing this book around 2010, I guess. But I became aware of Chomsky's writings, and I saw that he was exploring issues that were of interest to me, issues that I wanted to explore on my own, issues that I didn't have answers for,
right.
And I wanted to get answers for myself. So as I said, the book is as much about the issues
right.
as it is about Chomsky himself. I mean, it turns out to be a book about Chomsky because I'm using him
right.
to get at things that I think are important.
Right.
And whatever else you have to say about Chomsky, you have to admit that he has dealt with important issues, and very courageously. He's been a contrarian, but always relevant. But there was a particular spur to my writing, and I was reading, even long before I started the book, I read a blog post by somebody who I respect, somebody who I usually agree with, and he was responding. This was Eric Alterman.
Yes.
And he was saying that he had written some critical comments about Chomsky in a previous post, and he got pushback from readers.
Right.
And so Alterman sort of explained that, well, I know Chomsky has done some good work, but I consider him, I'm paraphrasing, and I hope I'm not, distorting what he said, but basically he said, I know he's done good work, but I don't completely trust him. He uses sources irresponsibly. His work is marred by ideological zeal. So I've had enough. So I sort of stay away from him. And that got me thinking, well, gee, if Chomsky has done good work, but he also has problems, has nobody ever tried to sort out what was good and what was not so good? Maybe that's, a good thing to try to do. So I started looking into books and articles about Chomsky, and I found out that indeed, either people love Chomsky, and there are a couple of books, that basically say that he walks on water, or they hate him. And then there are books and articles that try to tear him apart.
Right.
And I thought, well, gee, there's no really balanced, no effort at fair-minded, objective analysis of Chomsky's works. And since I'm interested in what he's done, wouldn't this be a good thing to do? I mean, to really be the first one to really try to get at Chomsky in a fair-minded and balanced way. And that's what got me started.
And I should say you do a very admirable job of that.
Well, thank you.
Right. You basically chime in where you think Chomsky is correct.
Yeah.
In terms of but again, you're very straightforward in areas where you think he's gone astray,
Sure.
and so on. And we'll talk about some of those both positive and negative as we move along. Okay. You say at the beginning of the book, and you're true to your word, that there are certain political areas that consume Chomsky's thought that you deal with, but others that you avoid. Okay. Can you just give us a brief synopsis? For example, you don't talk. Chomsky was a relentless critic of Israel,
right?
And you would think now would be his moment,
yeah,
so to speak. Yeah. And yet you don't talk about his critique of Israel, Palestine, and so on and so forth. But you do talk about other areas of concern. Can you give us a brief synopsis of what you include and what you exclude, and what your reasoning was in terms of covering what you do?
On the issue of Israel, I'll be upfront with you. I felt that this is such an emotional issue, so laden, so fraught, that whatever I wrote about Chomsky and Israel would determine people's reactions to the book as a whole.
I see, right.
It would predict them.
Well, you may not be wrong about that. That's true. Yes.
And I didn't want that. I didn't want everybody to read the book or reject the book on the basis of what I wrote about Israel. So I thought, in any case, it would take a whole nother book, really,
yes.
to cover the issues with Israel.
Right.
So I sort of left that out. I also left out Chomsky's political philosophy. He calls himself, sometimes he calls himself a libertarian socialist, other times he calls himself an anarchist.
Right.
But he doesn't really pose as a political theorist.
Right.
He talks about anarchism a bit. He gives some historical background, but it's not really his claim to, and he's right not to claim that. And in any case, anarchism is not. I was interested in looking at Chomsky and understanding how he explains the world. And anarchism isn't a framework, really. It's not an analytic framework,
right,
the way Marxism is, for example. So I didn't need to talk about that.
Right.
And those were basically the two, I think, significant omissions, the Middle East and the political philosophy.
Well, there's certainly very much that you do include. I mean, your book is a cornucopia of information about those areas and so forth, and we're going to have to avoid getting too deep into the weeds, so to speak. Okay. Chomsky is known and is mentioned, has been a severe critic of American government, especially our foreign policy. So let's begin with Chomsky's political viewpoint and what from the point of view of what he feels drives American interests, American policy, and how those interests present themselves in the international arena. Okay. He may not provide a tight theory, but he certainly has a certain analysis of what drives American power.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's clear that even though he doesn't call himself a Marxist, he's influenced by Marxism. And he gives credit to Marxism as a useful, framework for analysis. I think he really sees the United States power structure and that of other capitalist societies as class dominated. We are a capitalist society and we're dominated by something called a ruling class. I don't think he uses the expression ruling class per se, but basically that's what he's talking about. He thinks that political power is concentrated in those who have economic power. Very concentrated. They're the directors. And that they basically are running our foreign policy as well. That the United States pursues foreign policies that are amenable to our ruling class. That American foreign policy is basically about making the world safe for American business.
Right. So it's economically driven, practically.
Yes. In that sense, he is, I think, a reductionist. I mean, he really sees the economics.
We'll talk about that when we get into a critique of Chomsky's critique and so on and so forth. You know that throughout Chomsky's career, he's basically rendered assault on the myth, what he calls the myth of American exceptionalism. Now, the term American exceptionalism is given to several meanings.
Right.
What does he mean by American exceptionalism, and how has Chomsky understood the term, and what function does that term, exceptionalism, what function does it basically play?
Yeah, he doesn't use the term a lot, but basically, and this is a running idea throughout his career, he criticizes Americans' belief in the natural goodness of this country. We are good, we're virtuous, we mean well, we always mean well. And in that sense, we're special. We're not like other powers that have plundered and done bad things. We are, in that sense, exceptional. And from the beginning, he has devoted himself to exploding that mythology. America does very bad things in the world, and he wants you to know that.
And it's done bad things in the service of promoting economic power and interests.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
Essentially, yes. Okay, let me just take a look at something that you've written here and sort of developed. On page 53, he talks about the Cold War.
Yeah.
Much of his critique goes on during the Cold War,
Yeah.
the 45-year period.
Yes.
You say Chomsky instead believes that the Cold War was something of a smokescreen.
Right.
Okay, it served the needs of both superpowers for an excuse to consolidate their control over their respective empires. The American empire wasn't characterized for the most part by direct ownership of foreign lands. It was instead an empire of influence and control, utilizing economic, political, and military power. Its core objective was to serve American business in the pursuit of profits. Okay, how is let's pull that apart a little bit, okay? The critique is that the notion of the Cold War, or fighting a Cold War against Soviet totalitarianism, is a smokescreen that masks, in effect, American interests that lie behind it.
Right.
And Chomsky's role is to unmask it,
Yes.
and so on and so forth. Yet on the other hand, one might say that the Cold War was not fictitious. I mean, I grew up as a child in the 50s and 60s, and we walked around with a sense of fear and dread of ICBMs, the hundreds of intercontinental ballistic missiles that were aimed at each other by the Soviet Union and the United States across the Atlantic. This was not a myth.
Yeah.
There really was, in effect, a real power struggle. And to basically claim that it's nothing but a smokescreen and a myth put up by Americans who are basically masking economic interest seems to be not only one-sided, but seems to negate what was a real material concern and fear that the Soviet Union had its hegemonic interests as well. And so forth. So I'm wondering how you parse that.
Well, it sounds like you read my book.
I did read. I did read your book.
Yeah, no, of course.
No, but reading that, the
is,
question comes to mind.
This is, again,
it merely, in other words, it may be a smokescreen,
right.
but was putting up the Cold War and presenting it merely as smokescreen?
Yeah, again, this is an aspect of reductionism.
Right.
Chomsky likes simple explanations, but of course, there was much about much more than that. It was about ideology,
Right.
American nationalism, anti-communism, which is a potent combination. American nationalism combined with anti-communism. And, you know, I think for decades after World War II, it's not much of an exaggeration to say that anti-communism was something of an obsession in American
Absolutely.
society. I mean, Jimmy Carter, if you recall, roughly in 1977, talked about our excessive fear of communism. And that was a new thing. A president wouldn't have said that before that.
Right, that's right.
But it really was, I think the Cold War anti-communist obsession really colored a lot of aspects of American culture and intellectual life. And you can't just dismiss that as based in economics. It was more than that.
Yes, I think so, right, okay.
There's also the argument that, you know, the geopolitical argument. I mean, the United States and the Soviet Union were great powers, and great powers tend to come into conflict, if not competition, you know, latent conflict. But Chomsky doesn't believe that power is something that states pursue for its own sake.
It doesn't.
It's not meant in itself. The pursuit of power in the international arena,
Yes.
which is, I mean, this is a basic proposition of what's called the realist school of international relations. Power is an end in itself.
Right.
Nations are concerned about gaining and power and protecting themselves and all the rest. Chomsky thinks that's bogus. It's not real. It's really capitalism. It's about
Yes, in
capitalism.
fact, well, it is the question, there are power dynamics, but you're saying it's not merely the quest of power, it's the quest of power by economic actors who are seeking to expand.
Right. And maybe I should add, later on, Chomsky gives, not in his early writings, but I think sort of later on, he does recognize that power is pursued for its own sake, but that doesn't come through much in his earlier writings, so it should really emphasizes.
Well, okay, but you know, we can take this analysis and apply it to virtually his critique of every American foreign policy adventure. Your first chapters, and I think the most voluminous, deal with the war in Vietnam, where he comes into his political own, and it's also where I developed my own political theory, and many of us did during that period. Let's talk about the Vietnam. Now, Vietnam, as I recall, and I'm relying on my memory here, was defended by the American involvement in Vietnam in support of the South Vietnamese government, was defended by the United States as being, in effect, part of the war of containment. That is, since World War II, the prevailing dynamic of American foreign policy was to contain the expansion of Soviet communism, Soviet Union and its satellites, of which arguably Vietnam was. Now, one term you don't use, maybe you use it in passing, that was put forward by the government during the Vietnam period was basically restraining what was referred to as the domino theory, that if indeed North Vietnam took over South Vietnam, that would be the first step towards the communist takeover of Southeast Asia. Next, Cambodia, Laos, even Thailand, which was all neutral, would fall to the communists, and we were there to basically impede that as part of the overarching program of containment. How did Chomsky analyze the Vietnam War and America's investment in it?
Yeah, I don't know that he used the term domino effect, but first he stressed that this was an indigenous revolt against a puppet government that was repressive and protected by the United States.
Right.
It was not a revolt that was orchestrated by Moscow or Peking, which American policymakers often, wanted to portray.
Yes, but arguably there were two dynamics here. There was first the Viet Cong, which was an indigenous South Vietnamese force, which was not necessarily communist, at least not initially, and one could argue that was a rebellion against the Diem government in South Vietnam that was dictatorial and repressive, right? But then you have the North Vietnamese under Ho Chi Minh that is communist, who come across the frontier, in effect, to unify South Vietnam. So you have, in effect, we could argue two loci of interests, one in the South Viet Cong and one in the North Viet Minh.
The revolt started in the South among probably ex-Viet Minh operatives, and at first, the North Vietnamese were a little bit chary of this revolt. They thought it was, they were sort of willing to accept for now the division between North and South. They weren't sure that this would work, but increasingly there was anger among both their own people in the North and among their friends in the South who they heard from. And they allowed and even enabled the infiltration of cadres of guerrillas into the South. By the late 50s, the North Vietnamese were enabling were helping the revolt.
Yes.
Eventually, certainly by the mid-60s, they had basically taken control. They were in charge eventually. And Chomsky underestimates that. I mean, he, like many people on the left, I think, during the war, he tends to emphasize the autonomy of the revolt in the South from North Vietnam. It's indigenous, and that was reasonable at the time. But I think the literature, the work that's been done since the war has made it pretty clear that eventually the North Vietnamese did have charge of the war.
Yeah, now what is his analysis of the American interest? I mean, this was a huge investment. I think the first advisors were set there under Kennedy in 1961, and the peace treaty of Paris was 1975. So it was 14 years of investment. We had at one point, and this is hard to imagine, but I remember very well, in 1968 was the largest expanse of American troops in Vietnam. We had 600,000 troops. Remember during the Iraq War, we had 100,000, and we were spread thin. Back then with the draft, we had 600,000, 58,000 American soldiers were killed. And it was a tremendous investment, financially, militarily, in terms of personnel, and so forth. What was Chomsky's analysis of America's interest in Vietnam? How did he define it? Is it business interests? I mean, what was it that we were interested in doing?
On the one hand, he did believe in the domino effect. He said, the Americans are afraid that if a revolution succeeds here, it will be exemplary. There will be imitation effects. There will be revolutions elsewhere. So you have to show that a revolution is going to be put down. They can't get away with it. And he also did believe that the United States was interested in Southeast Asia as a market and a supplier of raw materials to Japan. That this region was of importance to a larger chunk of Asia. And that particular belief was sort of was criticized at the time as being a conspiracy theory. But actually, subsequent scholarship has shown that that was part of it.
He was correct about that.
Yeah.
Also, when one reads Chomsky, and as you make very clear, he's a thinker who posits his ideas in stridently moral terms.
Yes.
He's a moralist.
Absolutely.
Right? Good and bad American, right? And he's constantly bringing the moral dimension of the political environment to bear in his rhetoric and speech, what he writes about, and so on. One thing you make very clear in your discussion about Vietnam that Chomsky illuminated was the extreme cruelty of this war. I mean, the bombing, the destruction of Vietnam, its vegetation, as well as the number of people who were killed. We lost 58,000. The Vietnamese lost as many as 3 million of their people in this war. Many of them died under very cruel circumstances. And I remember napalming, and that actually changed. The moral, I just want to mention this because it's part of my memory. It was a moral photograph, really, a moral indictment that to a great degree shifted American public opinion on Vietnam. Do you guys remember, it won a Pulitzer Prize, that photograph on the front page of the New York Times of an emaciated Vietnamese girl in South Vietnam, I think, running naked through the streets, screaming she had just been hit by napalm, right? There was a lot of press about exposure of anti-personnel weapons in Vietnam, and that photograph had a strong moral reach, and I think really did play a role, not that alone, but was part of the moral indictment of what we were doing, and the cruelty in Vietnam. And Chomsky was part of that basically those who were exposing Vietnam in dire moral terms, right, wasn't he? And you write about his exposure to cruelty.
I mean, he was really one of the, well, he may have been the most influential public intellectual on the anti-war side during the Vietnam War years.
Right.
His writing is suffused with moral outrage. And he was outraged also at our lack of outrage. The fact that people could write about the war with a sense of detachment and cool, and it shocked him. He was truly shocked that there wasn't a more widespread reaction that would be more similar to his.
Right. Well, let's talk about moral outrage, but let's flip the discussion. One thing that you point out is that he seems not to be, he's certainly not even-handed in this regard. He doesn't talk about the moral atrocities committed by those on the other side. I mean, the Soviet Union, again, did not play footsie with those who were dissidents. It was a totalitarian and cruel system, right? And the North Vietnamese were not necessarily angels either, right? And read the story of John McCain and the American soldiers who were tortured at the Hanoi Hilton. That's just one example. I mean, they were capable of cruelty too. It's not as if America had an ownership on reprobate, immoral, and cruel behavior. It's the other side as well. And yet he doesn't seem to basically be moved by the cruelty of those entities, those actors, other than the United States.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think probably focusing on Vietnam as he did, he would have said, well, he didn't. He could have made the argument that, well, the means of cruelty, the means of destruction were very unbalanced. The United States had firepower. The North Vietnamese didn't. The guerrillas certainly didn't.
That's true.
He also made the argument, because he had been criticized for not criticizing the other side. He said, at one point, I don't discuss this in the book, but he did say, well, you know, I was entirely on the British side during World War II. I wouldn't have complained about British imperial abuses, you know. You don't criticize the side that's being attacked. And in this case, the real victims are the North Vietnamese, Vietnamese.
Right.
So I'm not going to criticize them. I don't think that argument really makes sense. But that was the one.
Well, it does depend on the perspective you choose to take.
Yes. I mean, in his view, you don't criticize the victims, even if they have some flaws.
Well, let's take one example of that I think was particularly egregious. Not that I want to spend the evening criticizing Chomsky's critiques, but you do talk about Cambodia.
Yes.
And here was a situation where I think he was really remiss.
Yeah.
The Americans under Nixon invaded Cambodia during the war and wanted to help facilitate the movement of American troops throughout that region, and so on and so forth. That destabilized Cambodia, which opened up the opportunity for the Khmer Rouge to take over the country. Now, the Khmer Rouge was a fanatical, sometimes of crazy Marxist regime that emptied the cities, right? Forced people into the fields. It murdered people who wore glasses, people like you and me, because we were intellectuals and part of the ruling class. They wanted to return Cambodia to year zero, whatever that meant. And they killed, out of a population of 8 million, maybe as many as 2 or even 3 million Cambodians, many tortured to death in torture centers. Chomsky, on the other hand, soft pedals his criticism, doesn't he, of the Khmer Rouge, and blames the media, the press, for exaggerating basically the excesses and violations of the Khmer Rouge. That doesn't feel good to me.
No,
that's hard to justify.
Yeah, no, I think this was his first really, really big misstep. I think Chomsky really wanted to believe that the Cambodian Revolution was a genuine liberating revolution. I mean, he was self-deluded, I think.
Right.
I mean, he wrote, basically his first statement on Cambodia was a 1977 article in The Nation, reviewing 3 books on the Cambodian Revolution. 2 of those books were highly critical or condemnatory of what was happening. A third was a whitewash. And you know, Chomsky had nothing but good things to say about the whitewash, and he had nothing but bad things to say about the other books. I think he was already developing his critique of the media, which I'm sure we'll be talking about. And I think he strongly suspected that reports of terrible things happening in Cambodia were exaggerated and distorted, and that served the purposes of American foreign policy. The idea that there would be a bloodbath after the Americans left Southeast Asia. The bloodbath didn't really happen in North Vietnam. I mean, there was repression after the Americans left, but it wasn't horrible.
Yes,
it wasn't a bloodbath. But now, look, it's happening in Cambodia. Chomsky didn't want to believe that. He thought that was somehow a fabrication of the media. Later, in a book that was probably written about a year later, or maybe it came out 2 years later, he conceded that yes, there were atrocities. Some of them, you know, some of it is real, but it's really not as bad as they all say.
I think, you know, again,
and in fact, it really was as bad.
Yes, that's right. I mean, for 20 years I taught human rights at Columbia University, and of course we looked at genocide as a major topic, and the Cambodian genocide, the Khmer Rouge genocide, stands out as one of the most horrific events of the 20th century. I mean, it's really not. It's difficult to soft pedal, let me put it that way. Okay, you move on in the book, away from Southeast Asia and Vietnam, and you talk about a consortium of countries that were involved in the Third World, that were involved during the Cold War, in which America had an interest in supporting what in fact were ignoble regimes, okay? And among those you discuss are the Philippines, Indonesia, and East Timor. Now, we can't get into all of them in detail. Why don't you select one that you want to talk about, and what was going on, and what Chomsky's position of American investment involvement was?
Okay, well, Indonesia and East Timor would probably be a good example. East Timor was a little piece of the Portuguese Empire, which collapsed in 1975, 1976, and the East Timorese wanted their independence. And the Indonesians wanted East Timor. Indonesia was an ally of the United States and was a wealthy country. There was oil, there were commercial interests. The United States was heavily invested in Indonesia, and it was strategically important. Some people had said, you know, Indonesia is a lot more important than Vietnam, where we, you know, going through the struggle in Vietnam. So when Gerald Ford, the president, and Henry Kissinger were in Indonesia, in Jakarta, talking to the ruler, who basically indicated to them that he was planning to take over East Timor, they basically said, okay. And they should have known that the Indonesians would be brutal, and they were. There were deaths in the hundreds of thousands. This small country.
Very small.
And the United States continued, at least during the end of, this was 1976, late 76, at least for the duration of the Ford administration, continued to defend Indonesia in the United Nations, pretended that nothing terrible was happening. The State Department's human rights reports were saying, oh, well, you know, yeah, there have been problems, but it's getting better. So this was horrible. This was a crime, and we were complicit. A terrible crime.
Right, but it was not, as you point out, I believe, and I don't recall that incident that clearly, but the United States did not actively support the Suharto government in Indonesia, did it? It just basically stood by.
Yeah.
It was not active, we weren't giving
Right.
military aid to Indonesia and so forth.
At the time, I don't know if we were giving. It wasn't a big deal.
Right. Okay.
But probably if Ford had said no, we don't want you to do that, it certainly would have given the Indonesians pause.
It would have, yes, but we did not. We stood by. We were bystanders. Okay, what was Chomsky's investment in that? What was his critique?
Well, it was just an example of the United States, great defender of human rights, doesn't give a damn about Middle East Timor. We care about defending the Indonesian regime, which had been truly a genocidal regime. After the coup in 1965, probably over 1 million people were killed.
Yeah, I know. It's a small country.
Most of them were communists. Rank and file communists, but it was a mass slaughter, which again, the United States did nothing to stop and even helped along a little bit.
Right. Okay, let's move the violence closer to home, to the Western Hemisphere, and here we can talk in greater detail.
Yeah.
And my memory of this is much clearer, I should say, than the Asian activity, and that involves Central America, particularly 3 countries, Guatemala, El Salvador, and Nicaragua, which is somewhat different in its history. But I remember well, I mean, the blanket story was that there was an American-assisted overthrow of the Guatemalan government in the 1950s, right, and so on, and that sort of spurred what was an ongoing civil war in which the military, in a way that was extremely brutal, destroyed 400 indigenous villages, killed hundreds of thousands of Guatemalans. Guatemala is still unstable as a result. I mean, it's nominally a democracy, but the army is still standing in the background. And the United States here, this didn't get a considerable amount of press, actively supported the brutality of the military in terms of training officers, giving endless amounts of arms and money to the Guatemalan dictatorships and so on that pursued the generals and so on and so forth. And I should say, I mean, this is sort of part of the ugly history. I mean, Israel also supported those Central American regimes in a way that does not bring it credit. And then we have in El Salvador, and in some ways that even got more press, and I was involved in the sanctuary movement to the day, so I was invested in that, where you had a civil war in El Salvador. This was during, I guess, the Reagan administration, most of all, and you had a succession of extremely brutal generals who ran the country, and there were 2 rebel groups. One was supported by the Soviet Union, the other was not, as I recall. But the United States gave an endless amount of military support and training, and so on. So one thing you don't mention, and refresh my memory here, Tony, we sustained a school for training, in effect, in Georgia. Right. I forget, you don't mention this.
I don't.
Where we actually trained military operatives from those Latin American countries.
It was called the School for the Americans.
The School for the Americans, which trained the most brutal techniques, including how to employ torture. It was absolutely a disgrace. I don't know what's happened to that. I hope it's gone, but I assume it is. But that was part of that Cold War type of anti-Soviet ethos. Our behavior is awful in that. I'm wondering, let's talk about Guatemala and El Salvador first, and your perception of it and what Chomsky's critique of the American investment.
Yeah, no, I think Chomsky was right. I mean, he was right to call attention to these atrocities. I think at times he overstated the American role. I mean, like in El Salvador, which I point out, the revolt started in 1980, or maybe even 79, while Jimmy Carter was still president.
Yes.
And Carter was rather feckless. He didn't really work at restraining the El Salvadoran, the evolving regime in El Salvador. But he did exert mild pressure. But Chomsky sort of overstates Carter's role and says that basically Carter was running things. We were behind it. Well, we weren't. We were tolerating it. But there's a difference between complicity and agency, which he glosses over. At one point, he talks about Carter's war against the El Salvadoran peasantry, which is ridiculous.
Right. Yes.
I mean, I certainly think Carter deserves criticism for not acting.
Yes.
But on the other hand, he was also under a lot of pressure from Republicans in Congress who
Right.
didn't want a Marxist regime. You know, and they were afraid of communism coming. So he had something of a balancing act to perform. But when Carter was defeated, the right-wing forces in El Salvador celebrated.
Right.
Because he did make some, admittedly, feeble efforts to restrain the atrocities. Typical of Chomsky, I mean, he
Overstating it.
he overstates
Yeah.
it. I mean, as if, if something is worth stating, you have to overstate it.
Right, okay. Right. Okay, let's
And of course, Guatemala was rather similar. I mean, things got worse under Reagan.
Right, but it was pretty bad. I mean, if you want to really condemn the United States for supporting tyranny and authoritarianism and brutal regimes, those are probably exhibit A and B when you talk about Guatemala and El Salvador.
Yes.
It's quite awful. I mean, during those wars, a quarter of El Salvador fled the country. Right? A lot of them are living in Hempstead, Long Island, right around in northern New Jersey. More of the country left. It was just absolutely awful. Let's talk a little bit about Nicaragua, which was more complicated in terms of the American involvement and Carter's involvement in Nicaragua. Can you tell us about that? And again, Chomsky's input.
Sure. The Sandinistas came to power in late 1979.
Yes.
They were a sort of mixed regime. They were certainly very much influenced by Marxism, but they weren't anybody's puppet. They weren't Cuba's puppet.
They weren't that hardcore.
Right. Well, there was a mix.
Yes, it was a mix, right.
And Chomsky even, acidly commented that our hard line against Nicaragua strengthened the Leninist group within the Sandinista movement. And of course, it got worse under Reagan, who actively supported a subversive movement called the Contras, who employed terror.
Right.
I mean, we were supporting and supplying a terrorist group to overthrow the Nicaraguan government. And this was a subject of great conflict in the U.S. Congress because a lot of Democrats, the majority of Democrats, were strongly opposed to our support for the Contras.
And what happened? What was the Carter regime's role in Nicaragua?
Carter sort of
it's a lot more complicated.
He was he was restrained. He was not too happy about the Sandinistas, but he didn't do anything very much to subvert them either.
Right, but Reagan did.
Reagan did.
Yes, actively so.
Yes.
By supporting the Contras and so forth. I don't know, nobody can tell the future, but here we have Nicaragua and Daniel Ortega, who was the leader of the Sandinista movement, who won accolades and support on the left, right, as being a type of person who overthrew the dictatorship and so forth in Nicaragua, and supported what looked like a somewhat more humane socialist or communist regime, has now become some right-wing dictator. So
it's
not somebody to admire.
It's a sad history, but in the 1980s, I think it was reasonable to regard Nicaragua as an interesting experiment in a kind of social democracy in Central America. But that was not an experiment that was acceptable to the Reaganites.
Yeah. Okay, let's move on. We did mention the media in passing, and Chomsky had a robust criticism, a critique of the media. Can you tell us about what role he thought the American media played?
Right. Practically everything Chomsky writes about includes a critique of the media. The concerns about how the media treat American foreign policy pervade his work. I mean, it's always there. And basically, he views the mainstream media, the TV network, newses, the major newspapers, as supporters of the American foreign policy, the establishment, and its policies. Fairly uncritical supporters. And his big book on the media was with a co-author, Edward Herman, called Manufacturing Consent. And I think it's a very good book. Basically, he demonstrates in case studies numerous instances in which the media basically uncritically accepted American foreign policy postulates, when in fact there was another side to the story which almost never got told.
Right. Although, you know, when you look at there's the media and there's the media. Okay, let's not talk about the current era with social media. We have a million different cacophonous voices. But even back then, in the 60s, during Vietnam, there was, in fact, what we call the underground press. I mean, there was a left wing. It didn't reach the masses. I mean, the masses didn't care to read it. We did on college campuses. I mean, there was a underground left-wing media and so on and so forth. In the Vietnam War, I recall, even among established journalists did have its critics. I remember reading, I don't know if you recall, going back all that period, 50 years, I remember reading David Schoenbrunn, who was a correspondent for CBS, was critical of the war in Vietnam. Harrison Salisbury sort of was critical. Right? So there were some established, respectable voices that were not totally in sync with the American line in that regard. So again, you have
even when they were critical, most of them, I think Chomsky quotes Anthony Lewis, who I always liked and read. And, you know, Lewis basically said, well, you know, these were our efforts in Vietnam, blundering efforts to do good. An unwillingness to really confront the full moral horror that we were perpetrating. An unwillingness to believe that America could do bad. Or willfully do bad. And then Chomsky basically said, this is just an evasion. You know, if something is evil, Chomsky doesn't use the word evil, but he basically is getting you there. He says, if something is evil, you have to say so.
Right, a type of naivete in terms of
American.
Right, no, I think he's right about that. I mean, most people want to believe that their country is good, right? And the United States can't really do wrong. So maybe a little criticism around the edges, but when it comes to interests, the United States is on the side of the angels, and so on and so forth. And that's what he's trying to tear apart. Okay, one more sort of world event that I want to talk about that you, to your credit, do bring forward, and that is the Iraq War. Chomsky, of course, was critical of both the Iraq wars, right, the Gulf War, and then George H.W. Bush's war, bigger war, that toppled Saddam Hussein. But after the First War, we had a boycott of Iraq, right? And this has not gotten enough historical attention, I think, and enough press, right? We boycotted Iraq, which the attempt was to hurt Saddam Hussein, but what always happens with these boycotts, it's the people who get hurt, and the rulers are able to live in their castles and so on, which Saddam Hussein did. But hundreds of thousands in Iraq, Iraqis, many of them children and so on, were deprived of food and medicine and so on and so forth. And that was a big loss of human life, and it was directly, the United States was directly responsible for that. And Chomsky did indeed attempt to expose that, and I'm wondering if you might put in a word.
Well, I think you've hit on it. Chomsky did repeatedly condemn the United States implementation of sanctions. Basically, it was sanctions that were supposedly administered by the United Nations, but the way things worked, the U.S. and Britain together were able to basically run the show. And probably at least 500,000 people died of mainly of waterborne diseases and malnutrition, mainly young children and old people. And this, again, didn't get really attention in the U.S. media, and it was not a subject of concern in the U.S. government. There was a famous interview, Madeleine Albright was asked, she had been UN ambassador, and then she became Secretary of State. Before she became Secretary of State, she was asked in a television interview, I think, well, gee, supposedly hundreds of thousands of people have died as a result of our sanctions. What do you have to say about that? And she said, yes, it's a terrible price that we've had to pay, but we think it's worth it. And later, she took it back. She said, oh, of course, I didn't mean that. That was a stupid thing to say. But it was stupid because it was frank.
Yeah, true. Well, human life counts so little, doesn't it? It's really terrible. I want to bring this to a close. I've got a few more questions, but I do want to read from your text towards the end, where you bring things together and create a type of summary. You say, in short, there's a great deal of merit in Chomsky's view of U.S. hegemony as an arrogant, brutal, disruptive, and exploitative force in the world. Can U.S. hegemony be justified? Chomsky certainly doesn't think so. Indeed, if Chomsky thinks that the U.S. government plays any positive role in the world at all, he never tells us so. Okay, his accounts of the exercise of American power are consistently uniformly negative, but there are reasonable counter-arguments, okay, that seldom come into consideration in Chomsky's worldview. This is Tony Greco speaking, I guess.
Yeah.
Okay, most scholarly analysts of international relations take a more benign view of American power. Doesn't mean they're right, it's just a contrary view, right? A substantial school of thought views the existence of a single hegemonic power as an important, if not essential, condition for world order. The hegemon provides a framework of formal and informal rules and institutions that facilitate cooperation among nations and thus make war less likely. I can go on and on. But this is an argument that's often made that does indeed, in effect, confirm America as an exceptional force.
Sure.
And that is that we need, America is the world's great superpower. And with great power comes great responsibility. And part of that responsibility involves deploying American strength around the world in order to create stability globally. This is the type of argument that's often made. And it is an argument, right? I mean, who knows? I don't know. I'm not. You're the political scientist, okay? So tell us what you think in this regard. Okay, that's the counter-Chomsky view, that American power isn't all evil, but the deployment of power actually is necessary for global stability. We'd have a much more violent, disordered, chaotic world if it were not for American power deployed around here, there, and otherwise. Certainly Biden would assume that, right? Biden's foreign policy is based on that premise, as indeed was Obama's, as indeed every American president's.
Right, right.
So what do you think? You're the political.
Okay, well, you know, in the book, here you're making me come out. In the book, I leave it open. Basically, I say, here's Chomsky's views. There are other views that are possible, and he doesn't consider them, and I don't take a stand myself. You know, I sort of lean to the view that the United States, well, I break it out between the Cold War period and the post-Cold War period. But even in the post-Cold War period, I think the United States has been more often a disruptive force in international politics than a creator of stability. I mean, just look at Iraq and what happened in Iraq.
Sure.
Look at Libya. You know, basically, we went for regime change in 2011, and the result was chaos in Libya and the generation of hundreds of thousands of refugees and related conflicts elsewhere in the Middle East. And of course, there's also Israel, which I don't discuss in the book. But, you know, I think, you know, the view that the United States is an anchor of global stability is basically the consensus view of the foreign policy establishment. It's the view of every administration, except for Trump, who has his own different idea.
Yeah, I just want to add a footnote to that last point. You know, again, as a student of human rights, we look at the role of what we call humanitarian intervention, right? And one of the great proponents of that was Samantha Power, right? Who was in part of Obama's security apparatus, and then became our ambassador to the United Nations, and has won great approbation. I read her magisterial book, Problem from Hell, which won her the Pulitzer Prize at the age of 33 or something like that. Very smart woman, and I assume she's a very humane woman, and so on and so forth. And her critique throughout that book, she basically documents the major genocides of the 20th century. And her conclusion is that in every single case, the United States knew about this, could have intervened to do something about it, but didn't. So her notion, she's a supporter of humanitarian intervention, and in part, in great measure, I would argue, we went into Libya, okay, in part at her urging, not exclusively, in order to try to prevent the type of chaos that ensued. So when it comes to, and this is a footnote to this whole discussion, but one that I look at and agonize about quite a bit, there are genocides in the world, and the United States is powerful, and humanitarian intervention most often does not work, but sometimes it does. You mentioned East Timor. there was a genocide in East Timor, and it was basically quelled when the United Nations, primarily as a cover for the Australian military, went into East Timor, and they basically quelled it. There was a horrible civil war in Sierra Leone, okay, and as soon as British warships came over the horizon, that war stopped. There are cases where intervention, including even American intervention, might indeed save lots of lives. Okay.
But just as an extension of your footnote to Libya, you have to break down the Libyan intervention into two phases.
Okay.
There was the initial humanitarian intervention, and there's a strong argument that the need for it was exaggerated.
It was what?
That the need for the intervention was exaggerated.
Yes.
But then the second phase was the regime change operation,
That's right.
which went far beyond any humanitarian needs.
That's right.
And that's what created the chaos.
Yeah, these things are
and that could not have happened without American
All I'm saying is that one could argue that the deployment of power, including American power, is not always for nefarious.
Oh, sure. And Chomsky is completely one-sided in that. And he talks about the intervention in Kosovo in 1999, and he says there was no humanitarian effect, zero. There was no humanitarian motivation. Well, there was a mix of motivations, and I don't think you can get around the fact that humanitarian concerns were in there. He's right that they weren't the exclusive motivation, but they weren't absent. But he doesn't want to allow for that.
That's right. It's not his interest. Let me just read one more thing from the book, which I think helps to sum it up. So you say, we have two diametrically contrasting pictures. One is of the essentially predatory hegemon, according to Chomsky, the United States engages in or promotes violence as it pleases, undermines international law and stability, subverts democracy and succors tyrants, and impedes poor countries in their search for economic growth and justice. The other is of the essentially benign hegemon, according to Brzezinski, Huntington, Kupchan, I don't know him, and many others. The United States promotes peace and stability, democracy and prosperity around the globe. In fairness, most mainstream advocates of the essentially benign hegemon perspective, including the trio just cited, acknowledge abuses of American power and thus present a somewhat more nuanced picture than does Chomsky, who sees no good whatever coming out of Washington. Brzezinski, for example, observes that neoliberal globalization has been far from uniformly benign, while Huntington eventually came to warn American leaders to, quote, abandon the benign hegemon illusion that a natural congruity exists between their interests and values and those of the rest of the world. It does not. At times, American actions may promote public goods and serve more widely accepted ends, but often they will not. That's Huntington, who is not one of our heroes, generally speaking, right? No. So there you are. You're adding a sort of the element of complexity.
Yes.
Okay, this has been great. Let me just add some concluding questions. Chomsky is now in his 90s. He left MIT. He lives in Arizona. His health is failing. He's not doing well at all. Let me ask you a question. He's an icon of the left, and again, someone whom I think some on the left feel is sacrosanct and so forth. You have not, to your credit. What do you think Chomsky's role has been, big question, has been in terms of inspiring the political left in the United States? What has been his contribution to a progressive, left-oriented politics, in your view? Big question. What's his legacy?
It's very hard for me to say. I think the left is sort of a large agglomeration. You can, with people who are barely left of center sometimes, identify with the left. Frankly, I don't know. I think he has admirers. I don't know whether the widespread admiration for Chomsky has really resulted in any kind of coherent organizational action. I just don't know. And I haven't really tried to determine that. I haven't really looked at his writings.
Well, maybe some more time has to pass before his contribution can be felt.
I mean, I think there is a lot of skepticism of Chomsky by people who are probably on what you might call the moderate or the social democratic left, because he is often irresponsible and simplistic in his analyses. And more than occasionally, as I point out, because I point out a number of examples, he's more than occasionally, as far as one can see, dishonest. I mean, he'll mislead you. And you have to be careful when you read Chomsky. Understand that, yeah, maybe he's giving you a side that you haven't ever seen elsewhere, but it is a one-sided picture. And if you really are interested in the topic, you have to go beyond Chomsky. Don't just trust what Chomsky tells you.
Right. Well, he certainly calls it as he sees it, that's for sure.
Yes.
He certainly does. One final question, Tony. Is there anybody on the American scene like him? Do you see anyone? I mean, in some ways, I see him as a unique figure.
He
in
is
his
unique.
brilliance, his outspokenness.
There was a political scientist named Chalmers Johnson, who died some years ago. I mean, who was basically similar in his approach to American power. Today, the writer that is nearest to Chomsky is somebody who doesn't call himself a leftist at all. It's Andrew Bosovich.
I know Bosovich. He probably identifies himself as a conservative.
Yes.
Yes, I know him.
Yes, but he's a very severe critic of American power.
Yes.
Hardly less severe than Chomsky.
Right.
He would be, and then, it's interesting, some of the best critiques of American power are coming from the right. The Cato Institute, which is libertarian, has produced a number of very good books on American foreign policy.
Right, very good. Well, let's all extend our gratitude to Tony Greco for very, very thorough analysis. Okay, we have some time, it's about 8 o'clock. So, anybody have any questions? Any thoughts? Yes, this gentleman.
I just wanted to know if he ever spoke anything about the United Nations. Any viewpoint?
Yeah, certainly he's a strong believer in international law, and he often points out how the United States was in the minority of the United Nations on a lot of votes, but being the arrogant superpower that we are, it just would frequently ignore UN resolutions.
Right. Okay, Mark, you had a question?
Yeah, I remember reading somewhere that he was suggesting that a lot of the immigration from South America was ultimately the responsibility of our foreign policy in South America. So I was wondering, how much do you think the immigration coming from South America is a result of our, the way we conducted our foreign policy for business interests and the destabilization of those regimes? How much of that would you say is true, which is, to influence the immigration, and how much of it is overstated?
Yeah, I'm not aware that that Chomsky has actually explicitly addressed immigration. He might have. As I said, I haven't followed his writings over the past half dozen years. Your question is one that I've wondered about myself. I mean, I strongly suspect that indirectly, a lot of our troubles trace back to what we did in the 1980s in Guatemala and El Salvador, and also Nicaragua. We helped sustain horrible conditions, horrible brutal regimes, and they've never completely overcome their problems.
Yeah, one thing we haven't discussed, Tony, in these terms is neoliberalism and the penchant for American corporations to invest in poor countries, and how indeed that investment can be destabilizing. Environmentally destabilizing,
Sure.
right? In terms of economic disparity and so on and so forth, and how that creates problems in poor countries. I haven't followed it, but I don't know exactly now what the economic commercial interest in Guatemala or El Salvador is, and how American corporations may indeed run the show there. I don't know that. I'd have to look into it, but one assumes that ongoing American investment in financial interest plays a role, and it may lead to, what I'm saying, political destabilization in these countries. Right?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, often Chomsky gives the impression, and actually he says so explicitly, that American business interests are the immediate motivator for American foreign policy. More often, I think business is in the deep background. We were concerned about possibly Marxist regimes coming into power in Central America, both because of their threat to American business interests, but because of the power of example. We didn't want that happening, and maybe sort of spurring other revolts elsewhere.
Of course, in many cases, we were concerned about a communist military beachhead in these countries as well.
Yeah, well,
right.
yes.
I mean, maybe you can't separate that from economic interest, but it has its own dynamic in a way. Any other questions? Yes, sir.
You ended by talking about Chomsky's contribution to the left and his legacy. I wonder if his emphasis on human creativity, generativity, spontaneity of language, that this is where he sees his linguistics and his politics as cohesive, if he's right about that. The idea that humans do have this innate creativity and spontaneity, and that the left has suffered a disastrous kind of dogma, in his view, of social constructivism, environmental conditions, that people are nothing but historical products. He thinks that the left does not have to be burdened by that. Is this a unique contribution of Chomsky's?
Okay, I'm not sure.
Tony, you may have to speak into
Oh,
the microphone.
okay. Chomsky, on a number of occasions, stressed that what he calls his scientific work, his work in linguistics, is not related to his political work. He claims that there's a wall. I think arguably the wall, is permeable, but the direct influences between the two aren't that apparent to me. I mean, he's very much concerned with language and the misuse of language in ideological discourse. So that may have something to do with his linguistic work, but otherwise it's not clear. The relationship isn't clear to me. And of course, as I said, Chomsky downplays it.
Thank you.
Very good. Okay, any final questions? Okay, once again, Tony Greco, thank you so very much.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, friends, here's the book. You can get it. It's Vanderbilt University Press. It's really beautifully put together. And again, it's extremely informative. This goes beyond Noam Chomsky. It situates Noam Chomsky in the types of political scenarios that we have been discussing. So it really will help you refurbish
You
your
can
knowledge.
still find it on Libris or
Yes.
or Amazon.
Yeah, on Amazon. Yeah, if you
Used
can.
copies, certainly.
Okay, there you go. Well, thank you very much. Okay, everybody, get home safely.